Thank you, Marco. So welcome to Konner Mitchener's final defense for his M.Arch. We have in our formal audience today is, of course, Marco Polo, who is our graduate director for the M.Arch program. I am representing the department on his behalf. And of course, we have our supervisor, George Kapelos, and a second reader, Masha, followed by two guests from industry, Joey Giaimo and Shannon Clayton. Konner, very quickly, same routine. You have 20 minutes to make a presentation, plus or minus, and then the committee will discuss your defense for about 20 minutes, and then after that, we will deliberate on the final outcomes of your presentation. So when you're ready, we can start.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I'm Konner, and I have a pre-recorded presentation of about just over 22 minutes. So if you'll all bear with me, off we go. My thesis is titled An Architecture of Shifting Mores, Transforming the Modern Downtown. Over the course of the past year, the title and focus of this thesis have continually evolved. At the beginning of April 2021, my interest in architectural conservation and modern movement architecture drove intentions for this work to center around renewing Canada's modern identity. While exploring the modern history of my home city of London, Ontario, I began to recognize connections between the fabric of the modern downtown and the decline of the downtown district that I had witnessed over the course of my lifetime. I began to focus on the effects that modernization has had on London's downtown to understand how we might be able to re-energize the struggling core. This thesis leans heavily towards analysis of existing conditions while treading lightly in terms of specific design proposals. My work aims to clearly identify the key issues leading to the decline of London's downtown district, while responding directly to them through the lens of cultural heritage conservation. An architecture of shifting mores represents a process of continual adaptation and reuse of existing assets based on the ever-changing needs of the community. This thesis contends that modernity embodies a cycle of ever-evolving values and cultural shifts. As collective opinions change and socioeconomic conditions are transformed, it is essential that we demand new uses and meanings from our built environment. An architecture of shifting mores diverges from traditional modernist thinking. We can no longer wipe the slate clean to serve our shifting needs. This thesis is cited in London, Ontario's Downtown Heritage Conservation District, where ideas of pragmatism, hybridity, innovation, and shifting mores were tested on a city block, resulting in the proposed design framework. This work responds to the conditions of modernization that have resulted in the city as we know it, and puts cultural heritage at the forefront of city building to find creative, new uses for underutilized infrastructure. At times during this presentation, I will refer to the downtown of some Canadian cities as the modern downtown. This is because many Canadian cities have been heavily shaped by the age of modernity over the past century. In addition, when describing existing infrastructure as underutilized, I'm referring to buildings in the downtown core that no longer serve a meaningful purpose in the community, many of which have been sitting vacant for years. The age of modernity, representing a state of constant shift, has now left many downtown districts struggling, vacant, and outdated as social and economic values drive people outward. In the book Modern Architecture, A Very Short Introduction, Adam Shar makes a clear distinction between the ideas of modern versus modernity, describing modernity as the condition of living in an industrialized society, shaped by modern science and consumer technologies, by mass production, mass markets, mass consumption, mass education, and mass media, and by accelerating globalization fueled by the power of global finance. In this respect, modern can be understood as an architecture stemming from the last 2 centuries of rapid industrialization and technological advancement. This accelerated urbanization brought on by advancing technologies will be referred to in this work as modernization. As mentioned, this thesis is grounded in the downtown core of London, Ontario, a mid-sized Canadian city exemplifying a struggling downtown core. London has a population of approximately 405,000 as of 2022, and has seen a dramatic reduction in the quality of life in the downtown core as the city sprawls along its periphery. Central London is comprised of a series of heritage conservation districts, each demarcating culturally significant areas representative of important periods in London's architectural and cultural history. London's core is also comprised of a great number of early, mid-century, and late modernist buildings.
Many of these modern buildings became protected under the Ontario Heritage Act with the implementation of London's Downtown Heritage Conservation District in 2013. While each building within the district is assigned a level of protection priority, the vast majority of them hold some level of cultural significance worth protecting according to the City of London. The survival and continued use of the individual historic buildings within the downtown core hinges on the vitality of the entire downtown district. Architecture has the potential to knit together goals of conservation of cultural heritage and urban revitalization through the renewal and sensitive adaptation of the modern built environment. The goal of this thesis is to push the modern city forward by responding to the conditions that have left it derelict. Conservation alone cannot address the myriad of challenges present in the typical Canadian downtown district. In other words, a careful balance between conservation and adaptation is our best way forward. It is imperative that we recognize the value in modernist architecture while acknowledging the negative impacts it and modern planning practice have had on the urban fabric over the past 50 to 100 years. As London's population increases, the city continues to grow outward via sprawling suburbs, leaving the downtown core behind. London's downtown district has seen a dramatic decrease in occupancy and overall quality of life for those who remain over the past decade. As economic and social values change and people move out of the core and into the suburbs surrounding more recently constructed periphery hubs, the downtown core struggles to attract visitors, businesses, and residents. This has become more evident as the gap widens between the rich and the poor. With limited resources, London's most vulnerable populations face no choice but to remain in the downtown core, where most social services exist. Concurrently, London's more affluent communities continue to drive the city's growth outward and away from the core. This widespread disinvestment in the core, paired with the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, has left an already troubled downtown district struggling to reclaim its once prosperous identity. Despite acknowledgement by the City of London of the cultural significance of its downtown area, many of its modern buildings currently sit underutilized or empty. The goal of this research is to promote urban spaces that demonstrate the antithesis of what Marc Auger describes as non-places. In the book Non-Places, Introduction to an Anthropology of Supermodernity, Auger describes the non-place as that which cannot be defined as relational or historical or concerned with identity. The design strategies outlined in this thesis illustrate an architecture concerned with promoting a sense of place in relation to its heritage while conveying a sense of optimism for the future. The Core Area Action Plan, prepared by the City of London in 2019, outlines that congestion, urban decay, and disinvestment made the core area less attractive to Londoners. By conducting a series of interviews with Londoners, city staff were able to identify the following keys to the success of London's downtown. People struggling with homelessness and health issues need help. People need to feel safe and secure. Businesses need an environment that allows them to be successful. And the core area needs to attract more people. The City of London has made efforts to bring life back into the core despite recent setbacks. With the transformation of downtown London's main stretch of Dundas Street into the new Dundas Place Flex Street, the downtown has seen some increased activity in the public realm. Dundas Place provides walkable spaces for social interaction, movable seating, and temporary shelters for street performances. This localized intervention reflects an awareness of the poor state of the downtown and represents a small effort to improve the public realm. This thesis is intended to contribute to the ongoing conversation regarding the future of London's downtown spaces. Lessons can be extracted from extensive analysis of modernization in Canadian cities over the past several decades. The current state of the downtown showcases the physical residue of nearly a century of modern planning and building practices. Many of the buildings and spaces that emerged from the modern movement lack meaningful engagement at the human scale. London's modern buildings are often surrounded by sprawling parking lots, leaving little to no space for the development of a quality public realm. While this car-centric planning was common in mid-century design, these sites are problematic in the downtown core today. The inherently modern idea of separating work from home or amenity from living space has proven detrimental to the city's core district. Once monumental to a prosperous business core area, many modern office towers now sit as a reminder of the dramatically changing social, economic, and cultural conditions of the contemporary city. In an article in the Journal of Housing and the Built Environment, Ivis Garcia compares modern city planning ideologies of the recent past with the shifting views of planners and designers today. It was not long ago that urban planners and policymakers believed that historic buildings contributed to blight, unhealthy, and unsanitary environments. A city works best when it incorporates diversity, that is, different uses, buildings of different ages, a variety of housing types, and transportation choices. This concept suggests that by bringing places of work, home, leisure, and support closer together again, and by promoting the reuse and adaptation of existing buildings of all ages, we can foster more holistic, sustainable downtown communities. The downtown spaces created by yesterday's modernists still have a role to play in responding to the changing social needs of the contemporary city. Issues pertaining to housing, safety, health, and economic vitality are often concentrated in the central business district of the typical mid-sized Canadian city. Through the raising of large swaths of land for new modern buildings and the implementation of car-dependent urban renewal strategies, the downtown area formed the physical residue of decades of modernization. The interventions that we implement now and in the future occur at and influence various scales to be explored further, forming a new vision of the Canadian urban centre. The scale of the building addresses the individual programmatic and architectonic interventions within a project that reflect the overall conservation or adaptation strategy. In this section, precedents are analyzed from a close scale to understand how each choice made in a project conveys the value and importance of particular aspects of the building in question. The scale of the immediate built context explores the effects a transformative conservation project has on the surrounding neighborhood. The case studies in this section demonstrate the benefits of creatively transforming underutilized or derelict buildings and the ability of such projects to influence further investment and regeneration of the surrounding area. The scale of the greater context refers to both the far-reaching physical and social influences that a building's transformation can have. A fundamental goal of the architecture being explored in this thesis is the informed response to changing needs of the urban community on a large scale. The Idea Exchange Old Post Office in Cambridge, Ontario is an adaptive reuse project completed in 2018 by RDH Architects. The project makes use of transparent insertions along the south and west elevations of the former Galt Customs House and Post Office. The original structure, constructed in 1885 and designed by Thomas Fuller, is designated as a National Historic Site of Canada, representing the popular 19th century Italianate architectural style. The transformation of this heritage site occurs through the careful restoration of much of the original structure and the addition of a transparent pavilion overlooking the Grand River to the west. Where the contemporary addition meets the original structure, bright and open space is used to showcase the complex, beautifully restored stonework of the former exterior facade. The Idea Exchange Old Post Office presents a vision of the future by exemplifying a new model of library. Instead of holding stacks of books, this structure presents users with emerging technologies and other hands-on educational resources, acting as Canada's first bookless library. The Idea Exchange provides valuable insight into how the heritage character of a building can be showcased and enhanced by additive intervention. The project responds to the changing needs of the Cambridge community and acts as a catalyst for further regeneration of the greater downtown area. The Green Building, completed in 2009 by Fair Studio, represents the adaptive reuse of a 115-year-old former dry goods store suffering from decades of neglect. While the interior of the building was completely renovated to accommodate a contemporary insertion housing a gallery, office spaces, and conference room, the structural masonry shell of the original building, including its street-facing facade, was restored to preserve its character-defining street presence. The Green Building exemplifies a careful application of contemporary values through the promotion of sustainable and forward-thinking conservation practices. The interventions applied in this project are aimed at preserving the historic character of the place, putting its value on display, while promoting the further transformation of other existing infrastructure nearby, and contributing to a culturally rich urban fabric. Fanshawe College, an educational institution with a presence in London of over 50 years, expanded its reach into the city's downtown core with the construction of its downtown campus building completed in 2018. The new campus builds on underutilized infrastructure, revitalizing the iconic 19th century Kings Mills department store facade along Dundas Street, while adding a contemporary 3-story addition on top, well set back from the street to preserve the original historic street presence. Fanshawe College's downtown campus responds to the growing need for access to educational resources and mixed-use spaces in London's struggling downtown core. The downtown campus uses the historic Kings Mills department store as a catalyst for further renewal of the adjacent historic storefronts. Images taken before and after the transformation of the Kings Mills building showcase the impact its revitalization has had on sparking further investment into the renewal of surrounding heritage properties. These and other case studies undertaken demonstrate how built heritage can be used on various scales to activate an urban fabric in decline by renewing a sense of adaptability and optimism, responding to changing cultural and social values. London's downtown core represents an opportunity to adapt existing spaces to address the needs of the community and intensify the downtown core to anticipate future growth while working to protect the city's heritage assets. This revitalization reimagines the Downtown Heritage Conservation District as a culturally and socially rich contemporary downtown space. The response to the conditions of modernity outlined above deals with three themes: social investment, creation of desirable spaces, and a sense of community. Social investment creates an incentive to return to the core by providing key services for London's most vulnerable populations. Social infrastructure includes access to quality and affordable housing, food security, employment, education services, mental health and addiction services, and other social safety nets, many of which are desperately needed in the downtown core. The second theme deals with creating incentives for Londoners to reside in and occupy the downtown core. Services like higher-level educational spaces, unique amenities like food markets and other programs that provide eyes on the street will contribute to higher foot traffic and greater perceived safety and comfort in the downtown core. The final priority of this intervention is to promote a sense of belonging in the downtown community. This theme highlights the importance of a variety and abundance of quality housing as well as spaces where people can contribute meaningfully to their neighborhood. As this work is centered within a heritage conservation district, any application of this framework must be carried out through the lens of heritage protection. Reimagining the downtown core involves respecting and enhancing the wealth of existing heritage assets it has to offer to visitors. This task involves finding new and innovative uses for vacant and underutilized buildings that respond to current and anticipate future needs of the population. Many of the large office buildings across the downtown now sit empty despite the vast amounts of highly adaptable space they present. The multi-story towers can be filled with the social infrastructure desperately needed to serve London's downtown population. London has seen a worsening crisis in mental health, homelessness, and drug use in its core area. These issues will not go away on their own. The foundation of this response to decades of shifting economic and social values is built upon providing equal and easy access to a high quality of life to all users of the downtown core. The transformation of underutilized modern towers into anchors for a larger infrastructure network takes advantage of their highly adaptable nature to fit necessary social programming near the ground plane of the downtown core. Many of the vast empty lots in the core present an opportunity for redevelopment into communities centered around key social resources and allow for the infiltration of greenery throughout the downtown. Empty lots can be divided into spaces for community, such as educational spaces, markets and grocery stores, community centers, galleries, and more at the ground level, surrounded by adjacent green spaces and parks and domestic spaces above. Through this methodology, London can build upon its existing natural assets, such as Victoria Park to the north and the Thames River to the west, to weave together a larger green network throughout the core. This approach can be seen as incremental, as each empty lot can be developed over time as needs change and demand for more quality spaces in the downtown grows. These community clusters can then be connected via the transformation of select streets into green spaces and pedestrian walkways, as well as elevated bridges connecting housing developments to each other and other resources to create a larger network. Rather than allowing unused buildings or lots to be redeveloped on an individual scale, this strategy works to connect the various opportunity sites within the downtown to a walkable network of green spaces, social resources, and cultural amenities, fostering a greater sense of community for all users of the district. To illustrate the application of this framework, a sample site was selected, presenting significant historic assets, underutilized buildings, and vacant lot spaces all within one city block. The site, located between Dundas Place to the south, Queens Avenue to the north, Talbot Street to the west, and Clarence Street to the east, presents an opportunity to redevelop underutilized spaces, create new desirable living spaces, and preserve the integrity of existing heritage streetscapes. As a first attempt at designing an insertion into the downtown district to promote its revitalization, the downtown core is abstracted as a simple grid, with roads, existing buildings, and proposed new circulation routes overlaid on top of each other. This approach informs a vision of a network placed on top of the existing historic district. This approach was inspired by design explorations where intersecting planes are woven together on an infinite scale, representing the ability of the layered downtown core to provide connected spaces for social interaction on both the horizontal and vertical axes. While this approach resulted in a complex and deeply interwoven system of social spaces, it lacked connection to the historic fabric it was intended to protect. Therefore, a new approach was undertaken with the character of the existing streetscape in mind. To preserve the character of the streetscape, Tectonic analysis was undertaken to obtain an understanding of the color palette, materiality, and forms prevalent throughout this portion of the downtown district. This analysis also reveals the stark differences between London's older Dundas Place streetscape compared to its more modern counterparts along Clarence Street and Queen's Avenue. Where Dundas Place exhibits a richly diverse tapestry of storefronts dating from the 19th century onward, the backside of this block shows a few sparse buildings separated by vast parking lots. This analysis revealed that the heritage character of the Dundas Place streetscape should be preserved by carefully selecting materials, colors, and forms that do not distract from the existing materiality of the street, without directly imitating it. By contrast, the Clarence Street and Queen's Avenue elevations present much larger and more flexible opportunities for redevelopment into mixed-use community spaces. The vacant office tower located at the northeast corner of Dundas Street and Richmond Street, as well as a larger partially unused office tower at the southwest corner of Queen's Avenue and Clarence Street, can both be adapted to host a variety of social resources including education and employment services, charities, financial services, health centers, and food banks. These towers then act as anchors on opposing corners of this city block, drawing people into the larger community created within the block. The vast empty lot space can then be reclaimed and turned into green park space and a community center, encouraging more traffic through the space. Finally, several levels of housing units can be placed on top of the community center, overlooking the historic Dundas Place streetscape to the south and the newly created park to the north. This site presents the unique challenge of matching the scale of the additive interventions to the scale of the existing context, with a variety of housing unit sizes that respond to the goal of creating a mixed community in terms of land use and socioeconomic conditions. The illustrations presented in this work focus on how the presented framework encourages interaction with the historic district on a larger scale. By providing key social resources in underutilized and adaptable modern buildings, social amenities in empty lots, and domestic spaces above protected heritage streetscapes, this strategy works to preserve the heritage character of the Downtown Heritage Conservation District, while responding to the various needs of its users on a district-wide scale. Reimagining a downtown in decline is not a simple task, nor can it be solved with a binary approach to city building. London's Downtown Heritage District represents a complex record of physical and non-physical transformations and shifts that have taken place over the past 2 centuries. The downtown is currently faced with a multifaceted crisis affecting access to housing, social resources, and economic prosperity. The design work carried out in this thesis acknowledges the importance of London's inventory of heritage architecture, while proposing solutions to the complex issues faced by the district. This work responds to the layered nature of London's downtown crisis with an equally layered intervention to learn from our modern history and shape its legacy going forward. Rather than erasing infrastructure that no longer serves a meaningful purpose in the community, new uses will tie London's empty infrastructure to a greater network of interconnected social spaces aimed at bringing new life into the core. While this design intervention is by no means a complete solution to the complex issue of a downtown in decline, it provides insights into how we might build upon existing infrastructure to attract people back into the core of the city. While this thesis concludes with a glimpse into what the downtown could look like following the proposed framework, the conversation must continue beyond this body of work. The unending cycle of transformation exemplified in the urban fabric illustrates the importance of approaching city building from a lens based on current and future needs. The framework outlined in this research, taking influence from the various case studies and concepts explored, forms the beginning of a roadmap for city builders and community stakeholders, and contributes to a larger discourse on the importance of investing in dense, vibrant, and culturally rich urban communities. Thank you, and that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Konner. I really like the pre-recorded presentation. It's very accurate and precise, and more importantly, on time. If you'd like to add or emphasize certain things in the presentation, now would be a good time, if you wish, Konner, before we begin our deliberations.
I'm not sure if there's anything that I'd like to go over. I probably went through a lot of information very quickly there, so if there's any questions of clarification, I'm happy to answer any of those. Okay, we'll do that then. If it's okay with George and Masha, I would like to invite our guests, Shannon and Joey, to start, if that's okay with you both.
Well, by all means, I think that keen to hear our guests' comments in response to this thesis.
So because I introduced Joey early first, I would maybe now like to invite Shannon to be the first to provide comments.
Is this for clarifications or comments?
Both.
Okay. So for starting with clarifications, shifting mores, you keep referring to this term, and I feel like I still don't quite understand what it means. Can you elaborate on it? From what I can get, it's that you can't just do a blank slate anymore, but that it needs to be defined by current and future needs. Is shifting mores like a term that's been used somewhere, or is that something that you've just come up with?
It's sort of something that was not, I mean, I didn't coin the term, but mores being kind of the concept of values or similar things, and then shifting being kind of the idea that they're constantly changing and evolving. So this was something that I sort of saw as I researched the downtown space, and it's something that I figure we kind of need to be able to respond to with any sort of revitalization of a downtown space. So you did have it right there, that we need to respond to current and anticipate future needs, and that kind of is the idea of the shifting mores. So they're this set of values that's constantly evolving. So basically, it's the idea that one prescriptive sort of ideal project can't really address all of the many issues that exist within this kind of space. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Does anyone have any other clarifications before I go into comments?
So how, Yew-Thong, how's it structured? Do we ask questions, or do we all ask questions and then we get into the comments, or is we just get one shot at this and it's all right now?
We can do it both ways, either way.
Okay, because I'd like to ask questions first, and I think, and I also like to kind of hear from others about their questions before kind of getting into more of a discussion. I think just coming off of Shannon's comment, I think the Konner's concept of shifting mores, I understood that. I think I'm trying to understand where it's positioned within maybe a larger theoretical or conceptual framework. So throughout your thesis, you speak about modernity, modernism, the modern. I know we're looking at it and with respect to a certain period or a certain ideology, but we're also looking at it with respect to a certain type of architecture. So there's you've thrown out a lot of kind of definitions of it. You've dismissed postmodernism a little bit, and I'm wondering, where are we here? Are we are we under the umbrella of modernity or the modern? Can you just explain that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the early kind of ideas that I had when researching or starting this project, or one of the early things that I came across was the idea that, I guess in my belief, or some people believe, that modern as sort of a period of time hasn't quite finished. Some people might argue that postmodernism marked sort of the end of the modernist movement, but the idea of the shifting mores or evolving kind of values, I found sort of related to this idea that modern is not necessarily over. So I found that the modern downtown, or London's downtown in particular, was very heavily influenced by the modern movement. And I sort of understood that some of the embodiments of modernism, so some of the modern buildings within the downtown, no longer serve a meaningful purpose within the space. And my argument sort of for modernism continuing or not being over is that, sorry, where I was going with this, is that they still have a role to play, and we have this sort of opportunity to kind of shape the legacy it has going forward, rather than just kind of understanding it as a period in time that finished and now we're into something else that's totally unrelated to our history. That's kind of where I'm trying to get at with it.
So is that in relation to the architecture? Are we talking about the physical thing, or are we talking about, again, the ideology, or maybe a bit of both?
Probably a little bit of both. I kind of understood it originally as sort of the architecture itself. However, you can kind of get into a discussion of the sort of larger values that are going on here. And in some of my deeper work in my actual thesis document, I talk about some different values that we see in modernism that are sort of embodied in the built environment today. So there's a little bit of both going on there.
Okay. Okay. So so where would, I guess postmodernism as a concept or ideology, and also as an architecture would, well, let's say it falls under this your larger umbrella. And I think that's fine. And I think, postmodernism is considered, the other when it comes to modernism, and it was a reaction to it. And, I feel that your idea of shifting mores is also in some ways a reaction to modernity, or whatever it's defined as right now. And I think that's important. But with that said, and maybe maybe this goes back to kind of Shannon's comment about what is a shifting more. Could any contemporary movement be defined as that? Isn't that what we're doing now? I mean, I know you've kind of placed a term on it, and rightfully so, because you want to give this thesis definition and clarity. But it could be anything, right? This is just something that you've attached yourself to in order to kind of find an approach for this thesis.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
You could definitely argue that.
Okay. Just another question. You've placed yourself in London. I guess this is your hometown. So it's interesting you bring up the issues that London is having. Our office is currently working on a cultural project within downtown Ottawa, and I'm hearing a lot of similar things that you're saying. And Ottawa is also struggling and trying to think about how it could rehabilitate its downtown core. And it has a lot of good stuff in it, both historic and both mid-century modern. So how is London different from a typical, even North American small town? Is there anything that makes it unique, or is there anything that makes it Canadian? And I'm asking because George is laughing. I'm asking because I'm trying to understand if the framework that you are proposing, if it can be proposed anywhere in any small town in North America that has, London's at around 400,000, any small town less than 600,000, we can apply your proposition to. Or is there something that makes London special?
I mean, sure, there might be some things that makes London special in particular, but I'm not sure that I'm here to argue for London's uniqueness. What I was trying to get at, or one thing that I do mention, is I kind of flip-flop between talking about London in particular and then talking about the mid-sized Canadian city. Yeah. I think London has a lot of aspects that you could see mirrored in other similarly sized Canadian cities. Places like perhaps Ottawa, I haven't been, maybe places like Hamilton that are a little bit larger, but so also exhibit some of the same sort of struggling issues within their core. I think the idea of this was, it's placed in my hometown because it's something that I'm familiar with and deeply kind of involved with. But the larger idea was to sort of inform a framework that could be applied to other similarly sized Canadian cities.
Okay, because you tap into, you really focus on Liscombe and Sabatino and their ideas and their themes on, Canadian modernity. So I'm wondering if there's kind of what is the connection to London? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joey. So we decided to take a two-round approach to this. So I'm just gonna maybe ask Masha and George to weigh in on any questions that relate to clarity.
If I may go briefly, can you go to your slide that shows the heritage conservation districts in the downtown of London, which I think set the framework for this discussion. I put the question to Konner, which is a bit of a paradox, is that London has identified in its central area several areas that it calls heritage conservation districts. One of them is clearly a district that has a collection of 19th century Victorian buildings. The downtown, and Konner, you can also go to the slide that shows the analysis of this, has a number of buildings from a range of different periods. There is a paradox, and Konner, I think you need to talk about this, about the concept of heritage designation as it applies to the downtown. And the buildings that are in various colors represent what the city is calling heritage. And I think that paradox is partly at the root of the discussion here and that's what I think the mores are about, is that how do you address this range of activity and building types? Konner, I think you need to spend a little more time just addressing this for us.
Sure. It's a good question. So, I mean, as we can see, sort of, I guess this one map shows various different classifications of buildings within the Downtown Heritage Conservation District. The idea that I saw of this sort of idea of shifting mores, I kind of understood it, or I saw it embodied in sort of the application of the Heritage Conservation District. It was only put into place a few years ago. It's not even a decade old, and we have sort of this wealth of kind of modern buildings as well as others that are all kind of contained under this Heritage Conservation District. But if you go there, you may not even kind of understand that some of them have this kind of protection or this cultural significance to them, because a lot of them have just been kind of left to sit. There's this lacking in urgency or kind of associated priority of protection for a lot of the spaces in the downtown. That was kind of something that I wanted to bring some emphasis to. London also has a sort of a district or a core area outlined as their core business area, and it's not quite the same as the Downtown Heritage Conservation District, but they have overlap. And one of the things that I found would be kind of important to do is to sort of make these two mappings a little bit more contiguous. So to kind of combine priorities that the City of London has for improving its business district as well as protecting its cultural heritage, because I personally don't see as much value in protecting buildings that are not being used or improving a district without kind of acknowledging and protecting its existing assets and its heritage. I'm not sure specifically what else you'd like me to talk about, George. I'm not sure maybe that helps.
I just want to make the point that there's a paradox in the designation of an area that is so diverse and has so many issues to call it a heritage conservation district. And the initial, I think that the direction that I encouraged or Konner pursued was one of how do you tie these together, or how do you somehow valorize it under this odd designation. And I call it odd because it's different from the other districts in London that encompasses such a broad range of buildings. And I just thought that needs to be put on the table, because the heritage conservation as a concept is shifting from a preservation mode or protection to something that is broader, and it has social, cultural, and perhaps economic dimensions.
Yeah, if I can just jump on that, I absolutely agree. And I guess you sort of made the point there. It's what's different about the downtown district is there's much more of a variety of different types of buildings. You see protected buildings from sort of London's earliest days that are older than the country of Canada itself. And then you see buildings that are also protected that are closer to 50 or so years old. Many of the other districts protect buildings or a set of buildings that are much or a part of a much smaller range of sort of architectural styles or periods in time. So that's sort of where me developing this framework came from, because this very unique district kind of requires a much more complex response to its conservation. No one building is going to have the same sort of response as the other. And I see it as kind of a district-wide problem that needs to be handled kind of holistically.
Sure. But this is a criticism of the HCD. I mean, this HCD was developed in the 90s. I mean, it's very simple how these are assessed. They're assessed based on essentially their physical value. Now we're starting to think differently and starting to think about intangible qualities of a neighborhood, and so it's tied to kind of social and economic. But back in the 90s, it was very simple, very, very simple stuff. And now we realize it's simplistic. So now we're starting to kind of think about heritage in a different way. But Konner, you're not getting into that. You're not arguing, you're not critiquing the HCD. You're actually, you're using the HCD as a physical framework for your proposition, but you're aligning with it.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
I know George is questioning it and critiquing how value was established within this boundary, but we're not getting into that here. We could.
Yeah, I think there is some value in critiquing it, but also I kind of needed to work within some sort of framework, and it sort of does work as a good boundary condition.
I agree. I agree.
I just need to maybe cut this short because we are digging a lot more deeper. And I'd like to maybe pass on the baton next to Masha because we do have another round to go.
Thanks, Yew-Thong. There is a line in the thesis, which is push city forward. And as I went through the whole thesis, I was looking for opening up that statement, and tell you the truth, didn't. Yes, they're different. I agree with George that the architectural conservation districts are, so to speak, very, very multiple in their meaning, that their definitions are very flexible. But none of those identifications are discussing or proposing what does it mean to push city forward. That's a question to Konner.
So I guess what I intended to portray or kind of convey with the idea of pushing the city forward is this idea of sort of responding to the needs that it has and kind of anticipating the future needs of the city. In contrast to the idea of pushing the city forward, the city is very much stagnant at this point, or the downtown district is very much stagnant, with a kind of increasing decline actually in occupancy, quality of life, things that I mentioned. So the idea being that responding to these issues, providing the resources that are needed, and all while kind of very carefully sort of protecting and putting on display the heritage that it does possess. I feel that these ideas sort of do work to push the city forward into kind of a new, more holistic approach to not even just planning the city because it's already been planned, but sort of reworking and revitalizing the city.
Tell me, car central planning is still, from your point of view, an advanced, or is it a very backwards planning of the city?
I find car-centric planning problematic in this area. London is a large and sprawling city, so it's unreasonable to expect people to not drive anywhere. But one thing that I notice is people tend to use the downtown as more of a thoroughfare to get from the north end to the south end or vice versa, and don't spend a lot of time staying within the downtown district. So I wanted to provide people the incentive to come and stay in the downtown. And that also involves creating more desirable spaces for people to be, not for cars to be. So this was one thing that has been started to that the city has started to address with the downtown, with the Dundas Place Flex Street that was converted to a temporary pedestrian street. I believe things like this are important to implement in the downtown to kind of create more quality places at the human scale, rather than just focusing on how many cars we can fit through and fit within the downtown.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Masha. I want to forego my questions and pass it on to Marco if he wishes to make any comment. But I do have one quick point of clarity from you, Konner. On page 46, you had proposed a series of facades, forms, and stuff like that. And then on page 41 through 43, you had did a very detailed analysis of all the existing built forms. And my question to you is, and also you have some proposed interiors. My question is more of a intent with pages 46 forward. Is this an urban design guideline? Are they architectural control proposals and stuff like that? If you could clarify that. You don't have to spend a lot of time defending it. I just wanted some clarity on it, and I'm going to pass the floor on to Marco, and then we'll come back and finish up with round two, keeping in mind that it's 11:50 right now.
Sure. So I did sort of try to frame these renders as kind of conceptual, just to kind of show an idea of what a sort of intensified urban block could look like. The idea was that this imagery was informed by these analyses that I undertook, kind of exploring the color palette, materiality, the tectonics of the existing space, and then trying to respond to them without without directly imitating them, using the exact same styling, and without distracting from the heritage value of the space. So similar color palettes are used, some similar kind of materials are used with slightly different forms that follow kind of the lines of the existing district. That's mostly on the Dundas facade. So the idea here is just to kind of provide a vision of how this framework could be applied to a city block and what types of development it may look like.
Thank you. Marco?
Thanks, Yew-Thong. I think in the interest of time, because we're tight, I'm going to defer to our guests, and I'll add something at the end. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll just now proceed into round two for final comments, giving a lot more emphasis on Shannon because she didn't really get a chance to squeeze in much. The rest of us managed to actually both ask for clarity as well as make comments.
Okay, yeah, I have a lot to say. So I think the thing that we're struggling a little bit on the clarity is that there's a lot of critical theory missing that a lot of the people on this panel are pretty acutely aware of, both on modernism and also on conservation. So I think that's kind of where the struggle is. And through working on my thesis, I looked into a lot of like post-war modernism criticism, like a lot of critical theory that was coming out of that time that was analyzing the problems with modernism. And then there was a lot of that came out of that fed right into postmodernism and then into contemporary architecture and urbanism. So I feel like you start to touch on it at times. You highlighted the map building and some of the ideas around there, but you don't really unpack it or criticize it. I think you might have gotten lost in that with your earlier design exploration. And like you mentioned Korb, you mentioned that Korb's already critical. I think you mentioned of his teenage modernism. So you're citing the fact that there's criticism going on and that modernism is evolving and changing, but it never really goes into any detail. And I know if you've looked into the work that George has done, and even in my thesis on, the CIAM at the mid-century, all their conferences around the heart of the city and how to really improve urban spaces with the ethos of modernism. So I couldn't help but feel like that was missing. And then on the other side of the coin, there's a lot of critical theory happening now about how to use modernist buildings and modernist spaces. And you touch really well on the challenges of modernist buildings that, they don't weather as well. They have poor performance issues. They, you address the fact that conservation around modernist buildings need to be different, but you never really give the context of what traditional conservation theory is versus what this new theory is, and to in order to compare them. So I never really, and then I was also really confused by the fact that your case studies are not modernist buildings. It seems like a missed opportunity to really learn from what's being done. I'll send you some links to some really amazing resources of things that I've been tapping into. The APT, it's the Association of Preservation and Technology. They have a APT Modern Heritage sort of focus that I just attended a seminar around modern envelopes. And then on the other side, there's the Getty Conservation Institute. It has a whole modernist, there are these really interesting factions of conservation that are focusing specifically on modernism. And I think it would be really useful to tap into that knowledge, because I think it would really help. And then the last thing is that I feel like your design intervention speaks more to the 19th century buildings than it does to the modernist ones. And it kind of seems counterintuitive to what your thesis was about, or at least in the beginning. So I think it would have been more useful if you'd picked one modernist building and tried to really flesh that out rather than try to address a whole block. So I think there are some good ideas in there. It's just that these ideas are not new, and there's a lot of theory that I think, because you're not quite tapping into it, it doesn't quite, I don't know, I think I've run myself into a corner, but I think, there's a lot of good ideas about, using, Jane Jacobs says new ideas need new old buildings, and then the latest stock of that's underappreciated and underutilized is these modernist buildings. So there are seeds of really good ideas there, but I just feel like they never fully got fleshed out. So that's my thoughts. I'll let someone else speak.
Thank you, Shannon. So we cycle to Joey now.
Thank you. Yeah, Shannon, I agree with you. I mean, I don't think, I know that Konner was maybe more interested initially in the mid-century modern building and how to tackle that rather than the kind of the more historic building. And I found that at the end, for the proposition, the mid-century modern building became something that housed support, it almost felt like it was a supporting building rather than sort of a building that could be more prominent. And the historic buildings sort of served as tapestry, and you tapped into that tapestry in order to kind of develop the infill part. But I agree with the theory. I felt, and this is kind of related to my question about where are we positioning ourselves? Are the idea of shifting mores related more to modernism theories or postmodern theories? And I actually think that this idea is more related to postmodern theories. So saying that, I think there's a lot of architects that you could have tapped into that could have helped develop your ideas. Venturi for one, but more so Aldo Rossi and his idea of monuments as permanence, because even though he's referring to the very historic building, what you're doing with the mid-century modern building is exactly his idea of permanence. And a building is there, but the program has to kind of change, and the memory of the building is retained through its physical structure, through its permanence, but the interior can constantly be reworked, and that's exactly what you're doing here. Ernesto Rogers, the Casabella movement post-war, the Italian movement that kind of looked at the pre-existing condition and really tapped into that and understood that for both adaptive reuse projects, but also mostly for new modern buildings. And also I always love hearing about the Smithsons making their way into any project, and it's great that you're looking at their map building ideas. But the Smithsons, I think their most valuable idea and maybe they're kind of least theoretical, just sort of a light concept, was the idea of the as found, and that, you know, that you can kind of really tap into, you know, a context by just really looking at what's around it. And that's exactly what you're doing here. So this is just like, you know, a very, you know, just a few names that you know, could have really been inserted into your thesis. And I think that maybe they're missing, because I felt going through the thesis that there were a lot of great ideas and a lot of great images, but I was struggling to find cohesion consistently through the thesis. And I found that I was looking for a framework, and you spoke about framework quite a bit. In section 4, framework was about additive intervention, sensitive adaptation, and conservation. In section 6, it was based on 3 themes: social investment, creating desirable spaces, sense of community. So there's a lot of frameworks there, but I'm still trying to understand what is the framework. And I think the framework came for me, again, going through the thesis, I found the 5 important diagrams in your thesis. The first one was the one on negative space, as it begins to develop a physical framework for your approach. The other one is the HCD boundary, which we've already spoken about. The other one is the figure ground, which again kind of taps into that negative space and also that solid space. The diagram for greenery infiltration, which I think was underdeveloped and could have like really used some more. And then the conceptual network, which I thought it was a great idea, but I also thought that this was first, it was, I think we're too far away here, and maybe we had to kind of zoom in a bit, but I felt like these were the 5 that would lead you to your proposition. And in some ways they did. It's just, I had to really kind of search that out to kind of understand it. So in terms of the proposition, I mean, I think there's some very nice ideas there. Architecture, I think this is a project in urban planning, really. Urban planning, urban design. Maybe we could even use the term landscape urbanism in some ways. And when you zoom into the block, I think, again, you're tapping into the resources, the existing resources. I'm not sure about the lengthening of the existing lot and filling that in completely. I think like there's going to be some serious light issues with the programming in here, but I think kind of taking over surface parking lots for parks, using these lots as kind of easements throughout is great. But I think I think you have to pull out of this again, and it goes to Yew-Thong's comment about are you developing urban design guidelines? What are you doing? And I think that's what you needed. I think that maybe the block was a prototype, and then you kind of zoomed out and you showed us how those other blocks connect to that one block, and how it becomes a larger network and a larger framework. It's almost like there's an inventory, there's of tools that you propose that start turning into the urban design guidelines. Just one last thing, I really loved your suspended city. Like you tapped into Yona Friedman's spatial city, and I got so excited about these diagrams, and I was a bit upset that they found themselves in the appendix of this thesis. I know you showed them here, and that's great, but and I understand the difficulties of trying to kind of connect with, you know, existing resources that are at grade and trying to suspend this whole new city. But and again, I think you need to look at some of the Smithson's work for this, because they also looked at you know, this idea of map building, this elevated city. And I think where it becomes successful is the points where this spatial city or where this elevated city lands, and the transitions and the relationships between the resources, the existing resources, and this kind of network that you're establishing up above. I think that's where the proposition is, Konner. I think it's this elevated city, because that's so exciting. It's so exciting. Anyways, that's it. That's it for me.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Joey. So Masha, do you mind offering some comments before we finish up with, well, not exactly finishing up, but before we move on to George?
Your sound is off, Masha.
Did we lose Masha?
Do you want to move on first, George, while she deals with her tech?
I think Konner, you've received some very important comments, and I appreciate both Shannon and Joey's responses to your thesis. One of the challenges that I've seen all along was that the thesis began with the modern building, and then it moved to the concept of what is modernity, and perhaps the idea that London, and I pointed this out to you very early, is that the paradox, which I said was the designation of this area, and was it about the preservation of buildings? Was it intended to do some kind of social construct? And moving to, and Joey, I think the megastructure idea was one that was very powerful, but it didn't seem to have a connection with the variety of fabric. So I think there was a point that you're making there about it's either one or the other, it can't be both. I guess part of the issue that I saw was that both Konner and I have very close connections to London. You may not know this, but this is part of my long time ago growing up turf. And the dilemma that London has with its core is a dilemma that is certainly a planning problem as much as an architectural. Well, it's more than an architectural problem at the moment. It's a planning problem. And the one intervention that was presented in the Fanshawe College is one approach to doing this. And so Konner had the dilemma of scale. And I think that he chose to address the larger scale, which now in hindsight might have impeded his reflection on these important singular buildings that are in the area. Nonetheless, I think that the idea of addressing this core in a holistic way is extremely important. It presents to us the opportunity that you can say, how do you keep what's there and build on what's there? And it may not be a conservation thesis as much as it's an urban design thesis, or even, and Masha pointed out in a previous review, the idea of the urban, the green fabric. It also had the hint of being a landscape urbanism thesis. I certainly support this thesis. I certainly think it has a lot to merit it. And maybe its construction at the outset as a heritage conservation thesis should have been reconsidered, and might have actually the shift as Konner moved through it sent him in a different direction. So that's all I'll say right now.
Thank you, George. I'll just make one quick comment, and I'd like to actually have Marco have the rest of the time after my comment. I want to echo everything that Joey had said. He used a couple of very important words. One of them was zooming in, meaning it goes back to my earlier question about those facades and those studies and what do they really represent as an outcome of your thesis. And then he used the word framework. And there are many ways you can approach breaking down this word framework. It could be an urban design framework where you basically say, here's the materials, here's the tempo, here's the scale that you have to kind of work with. It could be a planning framework where you talk about density and height and all those kind of things. It could also be a developmental framework where you bring in socio-economic issues. And of course, finally, it could just be a set of architectural controls, like for the lack of a better word, design review. So I think those are the kind of things that the design intervention that you're proposing should be kind of couched within. Otherwise, and I'm sorry for saying this, and I don't mean this in a negative way, Konner. Otherwise, the facade study that you've done is kind of random. It does not really represent anything urbanistic truly, nor does it reflect the interior of interior spaces. So those would be my high level comment. Again, it's echoing pretty well what everybody else is saying. The study, all the study leading up to that point, I think is very well done. And I'll leave it like that. Marco, take as long as you need.
We haven't heard from Masha.
Yeah, thank you, George.
Sorry. I'm so sorry, Masha.
That's okay. That's okay. I have my voice back on.
Okay.
On the screen. I would like to commend the thesis on comprehensive view of modernism. And by saying that, I would like to commend Mitchener on isolating himself from postmodernism and moving away from pre-modernism. So he's focusing on modern, and modern as it is in today's context, which is not an easy thing to do because there's so many and so much was done in between mid-50s or whenever you consider the latest modern and today. And he's doing that with accuracy, and he's considering modernism as a lucrative and important period in history of Western civilization, and specifically in Canadian. I many times asked Mitchener what he considers Canadian identity. We never agreed on it, and we didn't agree on it because it's not clear to, I think, neither of us what we would identify as it. But all in all, I think that it is a comprehensive study. It's a comprehensive analysis. It's probably, I would suggest that there is more than one city taken into account, because London is not your most, for instance, if to compare London to Hamilton, Hamilton is an industrial city and has all the, like it came up in the discussion, the comparison to Hamilton, and it has very strong intensity of industrial city, which London doesn't. And you know, many of the small cities have individual unknown caller have individual qualities, but they don't necessarily look similar. Unknown caller, or for that matter, represent similar qualities. All in all, though, I'm very supportive of this thesis.
Thank you, Masha.
Thank you, Masha. My apologies for missing you. Paul, sorry, Marco.
Thanks, Yew-Thong. I don't have anywhere near the expertise in this subject area that your committee and your guests have, but I'm very interested in these issues. So my comments will be more kind of at a higher level rather than in the kind of specificity that has already been addressed. I think this kind of research is really important. So I'm glad to see that this is being looked at in the thesis, in the contemporary kind of context of the thesis. The whole issue of the preservation of the modern, at least for me, who's not particularly well versed in conservation theory, but very interested in the history of modernism, I think it's an incredibly complicated discussion. Because if we are true to the ethos of modernism, then what does it mean to preserve, right? So it's this very delicate discussion between modernism as an ism, as an aesthetic, as an architectural vocabulary, versus modernism or modernity as a kind of sensibility or an ethos, right? So in a sense, it brings to mind for me, you know, Reiner Banham's distinction when he talks about brutalism. Is it an ethic or is it an aesthetic? And that's such a fundamental question to this discussion. So I think it's important work. I think the details of what's been executed in the thesis, I'm not as close to it as the other people you've heard from, but I think that becomes one of the kind of fundamental questions. Like when we talk about preservation of modernity, what does that mean? And are we reducing the modern to an aesthetic, or are we interested in preserving the values that generated that architecture in the first place. So that's a really difficult one, because how do you mores shift, right? How do you preserve values? Is that even something that we can do or choose to do? And if we accept that those mores are shifting, then does that mean that architecture is largely understood as a visual and aesthetic phenomenon that we simply continue to appropriate and use? And this brings us then to Joey's formulation of this, really, that's a postmodern sensibility, right? That all architectural history or all architecture is kind of understood in the context of being a historical style that we can then adopt to our own purposes, right? So I think these are some of the fundamental questions that need to be addressed in a thesis like this. And I think these are really important questions. And I think they're not adequately addressed in general terms, like in the world of architectural thinking, because this is still relatively recent scholarship. We're just kind of coming to terms with some of these things. I mean, the very fact that we are now talking about modern architecture being worthy of consideration as having historical value is still a relatively new phenomenon. And I would say that it's still a relatively rarefied discussion that happens within certain circles. But if you go to the public, the general public, and make an argument for the preservation of mid-century modern buildings, you're not going to get a positive response to that. And we can see that, so there's a certain urgency to this kind of work because a lot of these buildings are being lost. On the other hand, if we were really unreconstructed modernists, we would say, good, get rid of them because it's time for the next new thing, right? Whatever the spirit of the age brings forward. So I think you've taken on a really difficult and very complicated topic. And I hope this is something that will continue to inform your interests beyond the thesis. And I think that's one of the most important aspects, to my mind, of thesis. There's the work you do within the context of the thesis, and you bring it to a certain level of completion. And you will get, responses that vary in terms of, you did this well, you should have thought of that, and so on. But the real success of this is what you take from it going forward, into your practice, into the development of your thinking as an architect, as you take this into whatever comes next for you after school. So that's my comments. And like I say, I think this topic is extremely important. So I hope it will continue to evolve in your work.
Thank you, Marco. So Konner, I would like to offer you one last word, if you wish, and then we will ask you to leave as the committee adjourns to deliberate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think Marco really touched on sort of the most important questions here. Some of these really complex ideas were some of the things that I struggled with the most, and how to toe the line between, conserving something that may or may not have been intended to be conserved, or things like that. And this is work that I do think is important to continue beyond just a thesis. This isn't something that you can solve in a year. So this type of work, conservation, city sort of revitalization, all of the concepts that I've explored here are things that I do hope to continue to get to work on later in my career. So I'm happy that some of the concepts came across well, whether or not the intervention was totally successful. And I thank you for all your feedback and comments.
Thank you, Konner. So we ask that if you're the host, if you can assign that duty to George, perhaps.
No,
Marco's the host.
I'm the host. So okay. I will now stop the live stream and the recording. Before I do that, I just want to say thank you to everybody, and thank you to Konner. And we will deliberate. Like the guests, please remain. Konner will ask you to leave, and then George will be back in touch with you to debrief.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Konner.
Take care.